Welcome everybody. It's a real pleasure to see you all here in Stirling. As Lincoln says, my name's Richard Haynes, and as you can probably hear, I have got a stinking cold. So apologies for that. Probably means I won't have any partners for the Ceilidh tomorrow evening, but your loss, not mine. It is a genuine pleasure to introduce our opening keynote speaker today. Professor Philip Schlesinger gave me my first job here at Stirling 22 years ago, Philip, can you believe that? And I'm sure he's somebody that many of you know very well, or certainly read his work. Philip is Professor of Cultural Policy at the University of Glasgow, is Deputy Director of the CREATE RC UK Centre for Copyright, New Business Models and Creative Economy. And he has also recently become co-investigator of the new AHRC-funded Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre. Philip has been a leading figure in our field in media communications and cultural research, spanning 4 decades, if not more. I wouldn't like to suggest it was any more than that, Philip, and is of high international regard, I think it's fair to say. Many in this room will have used his work, his monographs, including Putting Reality Together, Media, State and Nation, Women and Men Viewing Violence, Reporting Crime, Open Scotland, Mediated Access, and the multitude of chapters and journal articles he's produced over the years. All have proven hugely influential in the field and across interdisciplinary fields in politics, sociology, cultural theory, and so on. His more recent work on the creative industries and cultural policy, in collaboration with colleagues at the University of Glasgow and the Centre for Cultural Policy Research, has received extensive support from research councils, leading to publications as The Rise and Fall of the UK Film Council and The Curators of Cultural Enterprise, both published in 2015. Philip, as I said, has got a global reputation in our field in media and communications research, which has led to a plethora of visiting professorships. I'm not going to list them all, but it spans from countries of France, Norway, Switzerland, Italy and Spain. Any others than that, Philip? I think that covers quite a number of them. More recently, this includes the Robert Schumann Fellow at the European University Institute in Florence. Recently, last year, Philip received an honorary membership of the Spanish Association for Communication Research, the first international scholar to receive such an honour. More locally, and I think I speak to quite a number of people in this room, Philip has been a mentor to many media and communication researchers over the years here in Scotland, and he's been a very strong advocate of media research and cultural research in Scotland throughout these years. I know I've benefited greatly from his advice and encouragement over the years. He has also made his contribution beyond the academy, frequently providing insight on press and broadcasting policy debates here in Scotland and beyond, and for the last decade or so acting as chair of Ofcom's content board. Finally, as a great advocate of media research in Scotland, I'm sure Philip will share our delight in hosting MeCCSA in Scotland for the first time and inviting the MeCCSA family here to both enjoy the Stirling campus and camaraderie that we have in our field, which I think is quite special. And given the theme of the conference and the principal touched on this in quite troubling times in a sense, and the question of, well, what next? What is the world going to throw at us, both politically and almost existentially, in a sense, of the challenges that we face as citizens, but perhaps more importantly as academics, as researchers, as critical thinkers. It is challenging times. So the theme of the conference, and also the theme of Philip's opening keynote, what's happening to the public sphere, is never more apt. So it is with immense pleasure and personal delight that I'd like to welcome Professor Philip Schlesinger to give our keynote lecture.
Well, thank you, Richard, for that really generous introduction. And thank you for being such an excellent warm-up man, along with the principal, because you have indeed divined the theme that I want to talk about today. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me to give this opening keynote lecture. It's really an honor to do so, and it's a great pleasure to be back in Stirling again, amongst its magnificence. I mean, really is an extraordinary day, and I had some great times working at this splendid university. Second, all credit to Alenka and Richard and their colleagues for ensuring that MeCCSA's annual conference has come north of the border for the very first time. This really matters to us in Scotland, and MeCCSA has been an important voice for us all. Politics is rightly at the heart of our conference agenda, and it's a really good call, because the national question in an increasingly shaky global order, challenged by the doctrine of my nation first, is firmly on the map everywhere, often accompanied by authoritarianism and xenophobia. So today I'd like to point to some challenges we presently face in discussing the public sphere. It's clear to me that the agenda is far bigger than can be addressed in a half-hour's talk. So I've selected some issues that strike me as important and illuminating, and I'm all too aware of what's being left out. It's, in a way, part of an agenda. And given where we are, I'd like to focus most on Europe and the UK, and inevitably glance across the Atlantic at the USA in ways that I hope have a wider resonance. And I'll close with some words on Scotland. 60 years ago, deeply influenced by classical Greek political thought, Hannah Arendt reminded us that entry into the public realm meant stepping into collectively experienced time and a world that we hold in common with others. This mattered profoundly, she argued, because it offered a guarantee against the futility of individual life. The classic polis, or res publica, Arendt noted, was the space reserved for the relative permanence of mortals. It's important to recall the fundamental importance of our political activity for what Arendt called the human condition. Politics is an index of who we are, what we might be, and how we might effect change. The public sphere is a spatial metaphor. It's a construct, the outcome of collective artifice. It's used to some extent in general discourse. It has a material existence in the shape of political actors and institutional life. It offers a normative position in difficult times. In a democratic order, arguably, the public sphere is still the primary locus of political communication and of the strategies and tactics that characterize this kind of activity. When we don the garb of citizenship, we take on a publicly defined identity, encountering rights and obligations in terms that are not of our choosing. In some regimes, we may be able to question and try to change the political order. In others, we may simply not. And these wider conditions of openness and closure determine the scope of what it is to be a citizen of a given state. A key question, insistently at the heart of contemporary politics, is what it means to be a competent citizen, what counts as pertinent knowledge for action, and how it might be used in voting, demonstrating, lobbying, associating, or otherwise trying to influence the political process. The mediation of political discourse, the role of experts, and the uses of evidence at times of ideological division, all are currently in question. Relations between cognition and emotion are now center stage. In a nutshell, is an ideal typical model of Enlightenment political rationality now passé. The public sphere is always structured in terms of prevalent power relations, so the analytical task is to understand how these work. The normative question is whether we think an open communicative space is a crucial good that's necessary to a democratic politics. In ideal typical terms, openness versus closure has long been the frame for debates about the domestic performance of the press and broadcasting in representative democracies. It's been the basis for classifying political regimes and media systems, as in the well-known comparative study by Dan Hallin and Paolo Mancini. Classification of media as free or unfree was a constant of the Cold War period and its opposed political systems. Yet the ideological relevance of such classification did not disappear with the collapse of the Soviet bloc. It lives on. To date, the pre-internet role of media in constituting public discourse, focused on the national press and broadcasting, has largely shaped debate about the mediated public sphere. The terms have shifted, though, with the advent of the digital age. Analysis has extended to how the digitization of cultural content and the workings of a global platform economy have changed power relations. Manuel Castell's decade-old study of communication power captured this turning point. Focused on how power was constructed around digital networks of communication, it analyzed the interaction between mainstream media and the internet as typifying media politics in the digital age. Castell's techno-utopianism is out of temper with the times, but his overall agenda was well judged. It pointed to the crisis of democracy, the gap between communication and representation, and a drift to insurgent parties. Notably, Castell's analyzed the role of emotion in shaping political judgment, describing electorate's capacity to reject evidence and to embrace questionable leadership candidates. These insights are relevant for present debate about the UK's referendum over EU membership and the election of President Trump, amongst many other leaders. Since the 1970s, Jürgen Habermas's early work has been the starting point for discussing the public sphere. It described the invention of relatively unconstrained spaces for public discourse, critical locations based in civil society, not captured by the state and official political power. Importantly, those spaces were national. Struggles for inclusion broadened institutional politics, so that whole nations on the road to representative democracy became general publics. This so-called Westphalian model, named after the peace treaty of 1648, refers to the sovereign territorial state, who has or who does not have a voice in the public sphere is a live issue. It's at the heart of debates about inclusion and exclusion. These have focused most on class, gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, and religion. The politics of expanded recognition brings new complexity in its wake, in the shape of contending identities, values, and memories. The European Union has exemplified the major shifts in conceptions of communicative space. 30 years ago, Habermas first considered how the EU might become a public sphere, a boundary transcending community for the component nations and cultures of the European project. Seeing this as a cosmopolitan possibility, Habermas's theory broadened to accommodate the digital age. It addressed how border-transcending networks, facilitated by communications technologies, powered by the internet, were changing how publics might be conceived. For well over a decade, and of great interest to the European Commission, the European public sphere became a major research project in political communication. A key issue was whether there could be a European demos, a political community facilitated by media and communications. Now, this was a step change. The EU's origins, after all, were economic. Its formation responded to the need for post-war reconstruction. But a fundamental benefit of the new common market after the disaster of World War II and previous major wars on the continent was the pacification through economic integration of France and Germany, and subsequently all the other states that joined the European community. This is conveniently forgotten or rejected by many today throughout Europe, but most tellingly in the UK. Some dismiss the focus on peace as merely the ideology of the technocratic elite that runs the EU. I think it goes much further and deeper for many EU citizens. The EU public sphere was a high watermark of theoretical post-nationalism. Projections of a cosmopolitan order and construction of a global public sphere were widely aired in academic work in the social sciences and humanities. But there were also intimations of a dark side. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, tensions between civic and ethnic nationalism were already evident across the continent. In 1990, Habermas noted right-wing xenophobic reactions to immigration throughout Europe. A decade or so ago, Habermas's post-national vision was influentially challenged by Nancy Fraser. She thought his work had only articulated a model of deliberative democracy for a territorially bounded polity. How could this framework relate to a globalizing world? Even if collaboration by international bodies and the rise of cross-border social movements pointed to increased global governance, Fraser wanted to know how a post-national public could obtain real leverage over the political and economic decisions taken in such a post-Westphalian world. Could a public sphere be both legitimate and effective when it became post-national? Fraser's answer, actually, just like Habermas's own later thinking, was aspirational. She urged us to envision new transnational public powers which can be made accountable to new democratic transnational circuits of public opinion. A decade ago, contrary-wise, I concluded that Europe's cosmopolitan aspiration had fostered a perilous delusion. If there was a European public sphere, it was restricted to the decision-making elites that ran the euro polity, those conducting single market business, and those that enjoyed privileged mobility across borders, including people like us, academics and students. These were specific rather than general publics. Their communicative spaces were, and still are, part and parcel of the democratic deficit of the EU. Today, cosmopolitanism is on the back foot. We face widespread and naked reassertions of the national principle. The sheer difficulty of attaining the ideal of global governance, of establishing a relatively stable institutional matrix capable of addressing common problems, is well illustrated by struggles to reach enforceable and enduring international agreements over climate change. These remain quite fragile. The political order on which much cosmopolitanism was premised has been subject to reverses. In Europe, like it or not, it implicitly rested on a continued Pax Americana, with NATO as the military linchpin of the Atlantic Alliance. In the present retreat from post-nationalism, the contours of the public sphere are being remilitarized both offensively and defensively. Evidence of Russian interference in US and other countries' electoral processes is hard to dismiss. Representing an America First coalition, President Trump's hostility to the EU and equivocal attitude to NATO have thrown earlier assumptions about the alliance system into question. The accelerating shift towards polycentrism in international relations is also reshaping global geopolitics. Think of the economic and military rise of China and the incremental drift of some states towards a new Cold War with Russia. In Europe, the post-1989 map is gradually being redrawn. Faced by the aftermath of economic crisis and widespread hostile reactions to migration, the focus everywhere has shifted to how the public sphere is constituted within states, the shortcomings of democratic institutions in devising an equitable and solidary social order means that the theatre of the national is a conflict zone. Even if national public sphere questions have resumed their earlier relevance, the post-national potential has not disappeared. It's deeply embodied in many of us, but in the immediate future, it faces hard times. Today's political antagonisms have been widely attributed to the rise of populism, a term whose meanings vary greatly in academic, journalistic, and general discourses. It's been around since the late 19th century, and while I don't find the idea analytically useful, presently it does carry considerable symbolic weight. Margaret Canavan's classic study argued that populisms commonly emphasize antagonisms between an elite, seen as corrupt, and the people, seen as virtuous and heroic, and that populisms also capitalize on widespread mistrust of political institutions. Jan Werner Müller's recent critical overview concurs. Relations between populism, fascism, and Nazism have been much debated inconclusively. There have also been recurrent attempts at pursuing a left populism. The varied politics involved don't readily fit a left-right political axis. Moreover, it's often difficult to draw a line between, say, established political parties in government and erstwhile insurgent movements. Populism sometimes ends up describing regimes. I won't address particular examples today, but I will consider some more general issues. The breakdown of party political loyalties in representative democracies, what political scientists call political de-alignment, has opened the road to growth in support for populist movements and parties. These are usually complex coalitions that cut across classes. In their study of Europe and the USA, Roger Eatwell and Matthew Goodwin note populists' common hostility to rapid and high levels of immigration, the social importance of lost group esteem and lack of voice, and perceived threats to cultural identity, especially how the nation is imagined. Political scientists differ over whether or not populism is compatible with representative democracy. Eatwell and Goodwin see populism as a revolt against liberal democracy that needs to be listened to. They argue that mainstream political parties have hardened their policies, notably on immigration, and often become populist light themselves. Müller also holds that populists' disaffections draw attention to the failings of democracies. He contends, though, that populists are anti-pluralists and a danger to democratic systems. In the end, the containment or breakthrough of populist politics in taking state power is an empirical question. It depends on the strength of political institutions and the attractiveness of alternatives in play. So each case needs analysis on its own terms. Of course, populism is not new to our field, any more than it is to political science. In the 1980s, in a well-known critique of the authoritarian populism of Margaret Thatcher's governments, Stuart Hall and others associated with the New Times project argued for a national populism of the left, able to seize the ground of patriotism and consumerism. Today, 40-year-old arguments about the forward march of left populism are back in circulation. Currently, the decline of political civility, uncritical adulation of leaders, and the mobilization of extra-parliamentary movements are all attributed to populism. Contemporary populist political styles are forged by an intensely mediated relationship between leaders and followers. Changed modes of consumption and distribution in a platform economy, the slow reshaping of the legacy mediated public sphere of press, radio, and TV, the challenge posed by political uses of social media, all interact with socio-political divisions in democracies to reframe our understanding of how a future public sphere may evolve. J. Blumler has argued that the crisis of communication for citizenship he discerns cannot be surmounted while there's a relatively closed political class coupled with a widespread lack of trust by citizens. Moving into the gap in trust, the Trump phenomenon has contributed an exemplary lexicon to current debate: alternative facts, fake news, enemies of the people, failing media. President Trump's Twitter stream is a source of unbridled denunciations of mainstream media coverage, the Washington elite, and his critics and investigators. In the UK, fabrications during the 2016 referendum campaign, notoriously how money saved by leaving the EU might be spent on the National Health Service, gave local substance to a so-called post-truth politics, which continues to flourish as we stand on the edge of the Brexit cliff. But post-truth is more than a smart slogan. As Peter Dahlgren notes, it's part of an emerging epistemic regime where emotional response prevails over evidence and factual analysis. An effective public sphere depends on knowledgeable political actors of all kinds. So current attacks on experts are very significant. Experts have no unqualified right to command public credibility. And as William Davies points out, sometimes it's hard to distinguish insider experts from politicians. Together, they may occupy an elite world quite distant from the travails of citizens' everyday lives. But that's not the only issue. It's that expertise and evidence as such have become objects of attack. For us, as academics, this is a serious political and professional matter. During the EU referendum campaign, one truncated sentence uttered by the British politician Michael Gove went viral as anti-expert discourse. People in this country have had enough of experts. Mr. Gove targeted economists who'd pointed out the risks of leaving the EU. Critical ripostes from establishment experts at the Bank of England, the Royal Society, and the Foreign Office proved ineffective. Other attacks on experts dismissed civil service impartiality on the economy and denounced members of the UK Supreme Court as enemies of the people. Any claim to expertise depends on knowledge producers observing credible practices. In short, expert status must be earned. A problem arises, though, when expert knowledge is dismissed altogether. The sociologist Harry Collins has called this the use of contrary expertise, the idea that research-based knowledge is just another opinion, and mine is as good as yours, whatever evidence you produce. Anti-expert discourse is a major concern for the academic community. Europe's national academies of the sciences and humanities now acknowledge growing public unwillingness to trust academic expertise. By taking the affective dimension of public reception seriously, the academies propose to make arguments and evidence more accessible through narratives and dialogues. Will it work? Keith Carn-Harris has analysed hard cases to illustrate the depth of the problem. These include entrenched denial of evidence that the Holocaust took place, as well as the blanket rejection of scientific findings on anthropogenic global warming. Carn-Harris has concluded that evidence simply does not counteract the resistance that's put up by what he calls denialism. Moreover, such denialism may today be enhanced by how the social media conduce to filter bubbles and echo chambers in what Natalie Hellberger has called the privately controlled public spheres of the social media. If expertise and evidence are readily discountable in democratic debate, and conspiracy theories, fake news stories, and mere opinion are treated as having truth value, this has major consequences for how we think about political discourse, human agency, and the future of public spheres. Is it still possible to deliberate generally about the common good? This in turn raises questions about how the circulation, production, and uses of knowledge and information are organized, and the efficacy of practical remedies for the fake news agenda. Engaging in fact-checking, challenging false statements, improving the public's media literacy, and the like have all been proposed. The LSE's Truth Commission recently detailed a wide range of possible interventions, including setting up new monitoring and research capability, with, if need be, statutory regulation as the backstop. Regulation is increasingly seen by policymakers as a way of addressing the crisis of the public sphere. The regulatory activism of the EU regarding fake news, data protection, and digital taxation is a case in point. So too in the UK is the regulator Ofcom's nudge to public service broadcasters to coalesce to combat Netflix and other extraterritorial platforms and thus save national audiovisual production. We may reasonably doubt that the competition policies presently in vogue are adequate to the task. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, a few thoughts on Scotland, or why the idea of a national public sphere isn't quite so simple. Scotland is a distinct polity in the UK, as those of you who visited Edinburgh yesterday will certainly know. The Acts of Union of 1707 incorporated it into a multinational state with England, in which Scotland retained considerable autonomy from the start. Scotland, therefore, has long had a dualistic public sphere and a media landscape in which the British and the Scottish are co-present. In these parts, since devolution in 1999, the re-establishment of a Scottish Parliament and the creation of a Scottish government, we've been ever more deeply immersed in the politics of nationhood. The constitutional question asks whether or not Scotland should stay in the United Kingdom, and if so, on what terms. That matter is not closed. Here, it shapes our everyday life. In 2014, during the independence campaign, the Scottish public sphere was passionately Scotland-centred. In 2019, for the third year running, it's overwhelmingly UK-centred. Because Brexit has crowded out Scottish matters in public debate. And this tells us much about the vagaries of a dualistic public sphere in a multinational state. Scotland's 2014 was the key forerunner of the EU referendum campaign of 2016. Nothing was learned by the British political class from our experience. The lessons of 2014 should have persuaded our rulers to take due care when calling the EU membership referendum. Constitutions aren't playthings. What we knew about the risks was blithely ignored. Caledonia today is doubly divided. We're politically and socially riven between those Scots who still want independence and those who still do not. But we're also Ukanians, to use Tom Nairn's term, facing Brexit, along with all the other Brits, and split again between those who want in or want out of the EU. For the past 20 years, devolution has supplied the institutional contours of Scotland's public sphere. It was enacted when the UK was firmly inside the EU. The Brexit issue has overwhelmed the Scottish communicative space and marginalised the Scottish political voice in the UK. It has also raised many questions about the future of the present devolution settlement. So whatever happens next, ladies and gentlemen, Scotland won't be dull. Haste ye back to join in the fun. And now a last word. This lecture is part of a work in progress, at least for me. And I've not said even half of what I'd like to, so I have to say you can count yourselves lucky. In a nutshell, I've argued that the public sphere is still important as a concept, heuristic focus, and space for thinking about the mediation and general practice of democratic politics. It's always structured in power and therefore a site of conflict. In her astute analysis of the political philosophy of emotions, Martha Nussbaum has observed the widespread neglect in cultivating our capacity for understanding, self-understanding, taking time and care to deliberate and to show respect for others. This neglect opens the door to what she calls the Monarchy of Fear. Recognizing this, we do need to think afresh about the challenges plainly faced by a once dominant model of deliberation and political rationality. Those who successfully articulate a dominant vision of what the nation is, what it could be and what it ought not to be, possess immense cultural power. The question of collective identity is presently the heartbeat of the public sphere of representative democracies. So how could it not be central to our research agenda? Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention.
Thank you very much, Philip. Don't go anywhere. We do have 5 minutes, I think, before we head to lunch to ask Philip some questions. We've got cosmopolitanism, that's a hard word to say with a cold, populism, post-truth, issues of the public sphere, all key words which I'm sure we'll hear more of through the next couple of days in the panels and roundtables that we're going to discuss. So there are roving microphones. If anybody has a question for Philip, please raise your hand and tell us who you are and where you're from. Anybody like to ask a question? There's one here at the front.
Thank you very, very much for an absolutely fascinating talk, a lot of inspiration. I wanted to ask you about the reference that you made to Castells and to Habermas. You quoted about the importance of emotion and then Habermas' concept of public sphere and obviously of the discourse in the public sphere. Habermas is of course relentlessly rational and sees rationality also from a normative perspective. Where he talks about Europe, one could probably say he is quite elitist because he considers European institutions as as actually a normative setting that should start and then slowly trigger down until the public finally will understand it and confer and behave accordingly democratically. This one could, and he actually has demonstrated that this concept didn't quite work out, and he reverted to nationalism, if one want to see it like that. Wouldn't it be a different approach to actually look at communication and see, well, maybe the rational model is not comprehensively enough and does not capture what we need in democracies? We should consider working on a communication model that takes into account emotion far more.
Yeah, I think that's pretty. Thank you very much for your intervention. I think that's pretty much where I've ended up as I've thought about this, without knowing what the solution would be. But I do think that we obviously have to take account of the feelings people have had and the rage people have felt and actually manifestly show at the kind of political situation we're in, not just in the UK but elsewhere too. And it's clear to me that if you like, the ideal speech situation, is it never was, if you like, anything more than a model. But it certainly does not represent how we might think of as political action and the components of political action. And we so my own where I've reached thinking about this over the last few weeks is, well, obviously this does need to be addressed, and I would link to this as well, the point I was making about evidence, because the assumption is, the assumption in this sort of circle would be, if you confront people with evidence, well, this must have a persuasive effect if it's strong enough. And of course that begs a whole set of assumptions about what evidence is, how it's produced, and how we learn the rules of the game of interpreting evidence. But nonetheless, that would be the assumption, and quite clearly that's absolutely inadequate to the times in which we live, which is exceedingly worrying, for anyone who works in an academic institution. It has to be, because we cannot assume that the things that we take for granted, we may well argue about theories, we may well argue about what constitutes good or bad evidence, but nonetheless the broad protocols are understood. Well, if they're not understood within the democratic space, what does this then mean? And the reaction many people had, and some people still have, to the Brexit vote is that some people are just too stupid to vote, or they're too ignorant to vote. And I think we have to entertain that as a reaction, not because I agree with it, but because I think we need to take account of what it signifies. And therefore it throws into relief a whole set of other questions about what I was trying to allude to, what it is to be a competent citizen. What do you need to equip yourself with? Well, of course, you don't get rid of your emotions as a competent citizen. But you don't get rid of your interests. None of these things that operate, if you like, extra cognitively are parked. So I think we're at a kind of a very difficult conjuncture where some fundamental questions about how we're constituted and how we act politically are having to be rethought. And these are the preconditions of the public sphere. If I had an answer, I would put it in a bottle and sell it, but I haven't. However, I think it's I just think it's important to start to take this route and think about these matters.
One more question. Say I am Noor Halabi, recently graduated from Annenberg, recently hired at Leeds. So I have a bit of a question and a bit of a provocation coming from sort of the, so to speak, global south. There seems to have always been an assumption throughout my education that there is an exceptionalism to the public sphere of the West, and it informs some of the conversations that Arendt or Habermas or all of the sort of big thinkers about the public sphere used. So I think part of the provocation I feel for me is that I'm starting to sense the uniformity of the dysfunction of the public sphere and the fallacy of the Western image of what the public sphere is. And I think that offers a glimmer of hope into understanding how other cultures have thought of the public sphere. So if I give the simple example of fake news, if you look at sort of Islamic culture, they have, not that it's, you know, perfect in every way, but they have a very specific view of fake news where the source, if it has given like a bad piece of information, you cannot use it again. So fake news has a very intricate system for how it works. I'm not saying every culture has a perfectly functioning public sphere that is equivalent. I am saying that we could learn a lot as researchers if we start to look outwards, out of the sort of one uniform system that we all use with this very much sort of this Habermasian vision, aspirational vision of the European one.
Well, thank you. That's a really interesting set of observations. I think, I would hope that what I'd said, you know, would suggest that I was emerging from whatever sort of framework has prevailed, and indeed I think it is seriously challenged. I don't know why we would not look for answers elsewhere, but you know, I think rather than think about this as exceptionalism, I think it's probably more useful to think about it as a crisis of particular forms of political organization. People may wish to think of them as exceptional, but their exemplary force, you know, has largely disappeared. So I think that the kinds of issues that I was referring to suggest to me that there is deep questioning going on, you know, certainly in much of the work I've encountered, rather than, if you like, a sort of militant desire to sell this particular product, you know, when it's no longer working. So that would be my response. I think all cultural systems have ways of dealing with truth and untruth, and the reliability of witnesses, and the extent to which you go back for more, you know, if you're getting a bad thing. So I think if those are things that can be rendered comprehensible and usable and can be embodied in systems, you know, then they can be transferred across cultures, you know. But I think all of that presupposes, from your own example, a great deal more understanding than makes it a kind of an obvious transfer. So.
Thank you. It was more of a thought for research rather than a criticism.
Well, off you go. See you in 20 years' time.
I think on that note, as Philip has laid down the challenge for us all, I think. One thing I do know is inside there.
Not fake news, Richard.
It's not fake news.